Before we begin, take a moment to make sure you're subscribed to this channel, because the revelations you're about to hear have been hidden in the shadows of Genesis for thousands of years. What we are about to uncover changes how we understand the first family of humanity, the early world outside Eden, and the mysterious figures the Bible mentions only in whispers. Tonight, you will see the story of Cain, Adam, and their forgotten daughters in a way you've never imagined. Most people know the story of Cain and Abel, but very few ask the question that unlocks one of the deepest mysteries in Scripture. If Cain was the firstborn son and Abel was the second, then who was Cain afraid of when he fled east of Eden? Who did he marry? And where did these other people come from? These questions were intentionally avoided for centuries, yet the answers have always been hidden in plain sight, waiting for the moment someone dared to look deeper. Genesis tells us that after Cain killed Abel, God sent him away, and Cain feared that, "Whoever finds me will kill me." This single phrase reveals something astonishing. Cain was not alone. There were others, people of his bloodline, who existed before his exile. But who were they? And why were they never mentioned directly? The silence around them is not accidental. It is a silence that guards a truth too unsettling for ancient interpreters to speak openly. If Adam was the first man and Eve the first woman, then the children they had after Abel's death would have been too young to threaten Cain. The only logical explanation is the one rarely discussed. Adam and Eve had more children long before the story shifts to Cain and Abel, daughters who grew up, lived and formed the earliest tribes, daughters whose names were never written, but whose existence shaped the earliest chapters of humanity. Imagine the world in its infancy, a land still glowing with the fading light of Eden, untouched by nations or kingdoms. In this world, these unnamed daughters of Adam would have walked across untouched valleys, learned to cultivate the earth, and formed the first families outside the direct gaze of God, and among them, one of these daughters would become the mysterious wife of Cain, a woman whose identity has been debated, denied, or erased, depending on who was telling the story. But why was she hidden? Why were her sisters ignored? Why did the earliest scribes record the names of men with great care, yet allow the daughters of the first humans to vanish into silence? The answer reveals something uncomfortable about how ancient societies valued lineage, inheritance, and the role of women in sacred history. Their absence is not because they didn't exist. It is because their existence complicates the narrative. Cain's wife was not an outsider. She was part of the first human generation. She was likely born long before Abel's death. She saw the tensions in her family, the changing emotions in her parents, and the weight of decisions that shaped the destiny of mankind. When Cain was banished, she became the bridge between innocence and survival, between the world near Eden and the world beyond it. Her role was not small. It was foundational, and yet, Scripture leaves her unnamed. Some ancient texts hint that her beauty was unusual, a reflection of the early perfection in human form. Others whisper that she carried a burden of sorrow, understanding the cost of Cain's sin but choosing to walk with him into exile anyway. Whether she left out of loyalty, love, or necessity, she became the mother of an entire lineage, the very people who built cities long before the flood. But the real mystery deepens when we consider the possibility that Adam had not just a few daughters, but many. Some traditions claim he had dozens of children. Others speak of sons and daughters as an unspecified multitude. These forgotten women formed the earliest communities, and yet their voices were never recorded. Their silence echoes through history. As we peel back these layers, one truth becomes clear. The story of Cain's wife and Adam's lost daughters is not a side note. It is the missing core of the earliest human story. Without them, the timeline breaks, the logic collapses, and the world outside Eden remains unexplained. With them, everything suddenly aligns. And if their existence was concealed, intentionally softened or minimized, the question becomes, what else was hidden? What truth about the first generations of humanity has remained in the shadows, waiting for someone like you to uncover? When Cain was driven away from Eden, he crossed into a world that Scripture barely describes, yet one that must have been filled with faces familiar to him, faces of siblings whose names were never recorded. The silence around them has led generations to imagine a barren world, but the truth is far more complex. Humanity was already multiplying, quietly spreading across valleys and fields, forming early communities long before Cain lifted his hand against Abel. These communities were shaped largely by the daughters of Adam, for they were the ones who nurtured, tended, gathered, and held together the fragile beginnings of human life. Cain, carrying the weight of a curse and the guilt of his brother's blood, did not step into an empty wilderness. He stepped into a developing society, primitive, yes, but undeniably human. The people he feared were the descendants of the same parents that he and Abel shared. These daughters and their early families had grown strong, while Cain now bore a mark that set him apart, a sign of protection and judgment intertwined. To them, he was both kin and a reminder of something darker. And yet among these people, there was a woman who chose to walk beside him. This unnamed wife of Cain is the most shadowed figure in early Genesis. She stood at the intersection of innocence and exile, choosing to bind her life to a man burdened with the world's first recorded act of violence. What did she see in him? What did she fear? What did she hope for? We may never know her thoughts, but we can imagine the courage or desperation it took to leave her family and join Cain in the land of Nod, a place whose very name means wandering, a symbol of restlessness and disconnection from everything familiar. In Nod, Cain and his wife began building the first city, a detail that ruptures the simplified version of early humanity. A city requires people. A city requires families. A city requires generations. This means that the daughters of Adam had already given rise to a population large enough to support Cain's ambitions. The ancient scribes were not telling a story of two brothers alone. They were describing the birth of a civilization emerging from the first human family. But why were these daughters omitted? Why did the record of Genesis choose to highlight the actions of men while veiling the identities of the women who made civilization possible? The answer lies in the culture of the storytellers, ancient societies that preserved lineage through male names, inheritance through sons, and authority through patriarchs. Women shaped the world, but often remained unnamed. Their presence was powerful, yet their names were carried only in memory, never in ink. Still, the traces are there for those who look. When Genesis says, Adam lived many years and had sons and daughters, it confirms the vastness of the early family. These daughters were mothers of tribes, wives of pioneers, healers, gatherers, builders of homes, and keepers of the earliest human wisdom. Their influence echoes through every generation, even though the text refuses to give them a voice. Cain's wife, one of these daughters, would have carried memories of Eden through her family stories, stories told by her mother Eve, stories of a garden where everything was whole, where God walked with humanity in the cool of the day. Imagine the burden of being raised by the woman who knew perfection and then lost it. Every daughter of Eve grew up with that dual inheritance, the memory of paradise and the reality of exile. As Cain and his wife built their new life, the contrast between what once was and what now existed must have been overwhelming. They were establishing the first structures, forming the first communities, and navigating guilt, fear, and uncertainty. And in the midst of all of this, a lineage began, one that would shape the earliest chapters of human history. Yet the deeper mystery lies not just in Cain's wife, but in the other daughters whose stories vanished. How many were there? What roles did they play? Did some resist Cain's authority? Did others fear him because of the curse he carried? Did some of them form their own clans, moving far from where their parents once lived? These lost daughters whisper through the space between verses, challenging us to look at Scripture, not only for what it says, but for what it omits. The land beyond Eden became a tapestry of intertwined destinies. Cain's curse did not erase his humanity, nor did it erase the humanity of those who walked beside him. His wife became the anchor of a new beginning, a mother of generations, a quiet architect of early civilization. Her presence reassures us that even in judgment, God allowed continuity, growth, and the unfolding of a story far larger than any single character. But what if the absence of these women from the written record is not just cultural, but intentional? What if their stories conceal a truth about early humanity that was never meant to be fully known? What if the rise of Cain's new world required silence around the women who truly built it? When we explore these possibilities, a new picture forms, one where Cain is not merely the figure of exile and shadow, but the first leader of a growing society shaped by those whose names history forgot. As the generations began to unfold beyond Eden, a hidden lineage was taking shape. One carried not only through the names we know, but through the women whose identities never reached the written page. These daughters of Adam formed the arteries of early humanity, spreading life into every remote valley and distant plain. Their presence was essential, yet they remain invisible in the narrative, like shadows moving behind the torchlight of recorded history. Without them, the expansion of humanity after Eden becomes impossible. With them, the story gains both complexity and depth that ancient readers were perhaps not prepared to face. The earliest families depended on these daughters for survival, for they were the ones who gathered food, preserved knowledge, and raised the children who would shape the world before the flood. Their contribution was not decorative, it was foundational. And among them were not just wives and mothers, but healers, artisans, singers, storytellers, and keepers of sacred memory, roles rarely acknowledged in ancient texts. They were the ones who passed down the oral traditions that later became the spine of Genesis, yet their own names were left out of the scrolls they helped create. Cain's wife, though hidden among these forgotten women, represents something extraordinary. She is a symbol of how much early scripture leaves unsaid. She carried the weight of her husband's curse, yet she stood beside him in building the first recorded city, proof that her influence extended far beyond marriage. She must have possessed a resilience almost unimaginable, choosing to remain with a man labeled outcast, murderer, and wanderer. In doing so, she became the root of a lineage that shaped the earliest advances of humanity, from music to metallurgy, from agriculture to architecture. But beneath this story lies a deeper question. Why did the scribes refuse to name these women? Was it simply cultural tradition, or was there something more? Something too complex or too controversial to preserve openly? Some ancient traditions suggest that certain daughters of Adam were exceptionally gifted, possessing a purity of form and intellect reflective of early creation. Their presence may have raised difficult questions about the divine image in humanity, questions that later generations preferred to obscure. So instead of names, we are given silence. Instead of stories, we are given shadows. Yet Scripture offers a quiet clue in Genesis 5, a verse often overlooked. He had sons and daughters. This subtle phrase implies a multitude, a great expansion of humanity that formed clans, gathered kingdoms, and spread across lands unknown. The daughters were numerous, and their descendants formed the fabric of early society. And when Cain asked God to protect him from those who might kill him, it was these descendants he feared, the ones who had grown into adulthood, while the drama of Cain and Abel unfolded. Imagine the tension when Cain first approached one of these daughters and asked her to join him in exile. How must her family have responded? Did they see Cain as dangerous, cursed, unpredictable? Or did they believe God's mark would shield him and thus protect her? The emotional complexity behind such a union is staggering. And yet, despite the weight of this decision, her identity vanished into the folds of unwritten history. Once in Nod, she became the silent mother of a new line, a line that produced innovators, city builders, musicians, craftsmen, and warriors. Cain's descendants shaped culture itself, and every one of them traced back to this woman whose name was never recorded. Without her, the story of early humanity would be empty, fragmented, impossible. She was a carrier of memory, breath, and destiny, even as the world around her was still forming its very first patterns. But the silence surrounding these daughters raises another possibility. What if some of them chose different paths? What if certain daughters separated from the family and moved far away, forming their own communities untouched by the legacy of Cain or the grief of Abel's death? If so, then early humanity may have been far more diverse and widespread than Scripture explicitly describes. These lost branches of Adam's family tree may have developed independently, carrying with them stories of Eden that were slowly altered, forgotten, or transformed into myths. The existence of these scattered daughters challenges the simplistic image of early humanity as small and isolated. It paints a picture of a world in motion, full of growing clans, shifting alliances, and emerging social structures. Cain's exile was not a step into emptiness, but into a living, breathing world filled with his own kin. His wife walked beside him, perhaps carrying the stories of her mother Eve, stories that must have felt almost mythic as their world expanded into something vast and unknown. Through her, through the unnamed daughters, humanity did more than survive. It evolved. They built homes, cultivated fields, raised children, taught skills, and preserved wisdom. They were the silent architects of civilization, even though their recognition was sacrificed to the priorities of ancient storytelling. And the greatest mystery is this: their absence from the written record invites us to wonder what truths about human origins were left unsaid, what stories were softened, and what revelations lie between the lines of Genesis, waiting for those who dare to search. As humanity spread further from Eden, a strange paradox began to unfold. The memory of the garden grew dimmer with each generation, yet its echo lingered in the stories whispered by the daughters of Adam, stories of a world where nature responded to human will, where shame had no meaning, and where God's presence was not something imagined, but experienced. These daughters, though unnamed, carried within them the spiritual inheritance of Eve, and through their voices the earliest humans remembered a paradise they would never see. Their stories were the only bridge between what was lost and what was becoming. Cain's wife would have been among the last generation to hear these memories in their purest form. The tales she learned from Eve were not about doctrine or law. They were about presence, loss, and longing. Imagine her listening as Eve described the sound of God walking through the garden, the overwhelming harmony of creation, and the shock of the first separation from divine light. These stories must have shaped her understanding of the world far more deeply than the fear of Cain's exile. She walked beside a man condemned to wander, yet within her heart she carried the memory of Eden itself, a memory strong enough to guide her through lands untouched by human hands. But with each new generation born in Nod, or scattered across the fertile lands east of Eden, the memory of that original world shifted. Imagination replaced certainty. Symbol became story. Story became myth. And myth became silence. The daughters who had inherited the clearest understanding of Eden slowly vanished from the narrative, leaving future generations with only the faint echoes of their wisdom. Their disappearance is one of Scripture's greatest enigmas, for without them, the emotional and spiritual continuity of early humanity becomes fragmented. In this silence, something else emerges, a glimpse into how ancient societies preserved history. Men who built cities, fought wars, or forged tools were remembered. Women who shaped families, communities, and culture were omitted, not because they lacked importance, but because their influence was too deeply woven into everyday life to be recorded in brief genealogies. Their legacy was not written, it was lived. Still, their absence invites us to imagine what the world might know today if their stories had been preserved with the same reverence given to kings and patriarchs. Cain's wife stands as the most symbolic example of this omission. She was the mother of a lineage that would eventually include innovators like Jubal, the father of music, and Tubal-Cain, the first metalworker, figures who transformed humanity's relationship with art and technology. Yet the woman who gave them life remains invisible. The irony is striking. Her sons' names carried across millennia, while hers vanished on the very day she was born. And yet everything they became traces back to her resilience, her strength, and her unwavering presence beside a man who carried the mark of divine judgment. But what if her anonymity was intentional for reasons beyond cultural tradition? Some ancient interpretations suggest that certain early women possessed extraordinary knowledge of healing plants, celestial patterns, and cycles of creation. Such wisdom, passed from Eve to her daughters, may have been considered too sacred or too dangerous to record explicitly. If these women were the last to carry unbroken memories of Eden, their understanding of the world would have surpassed anything future generations were capable of grasping. In this context, their absence may have been a protective silence, guarding truths that would later be diluted or misunderstood. Consider also the emotional dimension of their disappearance. Eve herself experienced both the glory of Eden and the agony of losing Abel, the fear for Cain and the weight of humanity's first sins. Her daughters inherited this dual legacy, the ache for perfection lost and the challenge of living in a world that no longer reflected it. Each generation carried this tension, an inner conflict between longing and survival. Perhaps the ancient scribes could not capture this emotional complexity in a few lines of text, so the daughters slipped quietly into the background of the story, influencing everything but recorded almost nowhere. Yet their influence remains undeniable. Without them, humanity could not have spread, communities would not have formed, and the lineage leading to both Cain and Seth would collapse. These daughters were the living threads weaving the human story together. As they dispersed into different regions, They shaped early traditions, rituals, and beliefs. It's possible that some of these early women became matriarchs of clans whose descendants would later appear in scripture under entirely different names, their connection to Adam forgotten but not erased. As we contemplate their silence, another question arises. What truths about early humanity were intentionally left in the shadows? Why does the narrative focus so heavily on the movements of Cain while ignoring the women whose choices made his survival possible? Perhaps the answer lies not in what scripture says, but in what it protects. The stories of these first women may reveal more about human origins, divine intention, and the mysterious relationship between God and creation than the early world was ready to understand. Their disappearance from the written text does not diminish their legacy, it deepens the mystery. And within that mystery lies the key to understanding the hidden history of the world before the flood. A world shaped not only by men whose names were preserved, but by women whose silence speaks louder than any genealogy ever could. As time moved forward, the line of Cain began to grow into something far greater than anyone could have imagined. The early world, once quiet and almost untouched, slowly transformed into a network of settlements, fields, and gathering places shaped by generations who learned to survive outside the shadow of Eden. Each of these communities carried pieces of the original human story, fragments passed down through the unnamed daughters of Adam. Their words, their memories, and their traditions became the invisible architecture upon which early civilization was built. Even though their names were never inked onto scrolls, their influence formed the foundation of everything humanity would become. The growth of Cain's lineage was not simply a tale of physical expansion, but of cultural awakening. His descendants became innovators, creators of tools, instruments, and structures that would define the age before the flood. Yet behind each of these advancements was the quiet support of the women who nurtured the children, preserved the knowledge, and stabilized the young communities that were emerging in the world outside Eden. These women were the true carriers of human continuity. Even when the spotlight of history was directed toward their husbands, sons, and brothers. Cain's wife, at the center of this growing world, must have witnessed changes beyond anything her mother Eve could have anticipated. She saw the rise of the first city, the development of trade, and the birth of music and craftsmanship. She raised children who would become the architects and artists of early humanity, and she carried the weight of knowing that her husband's story began with bloodshed, a past that must have followed them like a shadow, even as they built a future filled with innovation. The contrast between Cain's curse and the accomplishments of his descendants reveals a profound truth. Even those marked by failure can produce beauty, transformation, and culture. And yet, despite these developments, the silence surrounding the early women remains. Their absence from the text forces us to piece together their stories from hints and consequences rather than direct testimony. Their influence appears indirectly, through the sons they raised, the traditions they preserved, and the communities they nurtured. It is as though their presence was too vast, too interwoven with daily life, to be captured in a few lines of scripture. They were not forgotten because they were insignificant, but because they were foundational. Their contributions were so essential that they became invisible in the narrative framework of ancient storytelling. But this silence deepens the mystery of early humanity. If the daughters of Adam were the carriers of culture, then they were also the carriers of memory, especially the memory of Eden. As generations moved further from the garden and the stories were repeated and reshaped, some details must have been lost, while others were transformed into symbolic language. Over time, the clarity of Eden blurred into mythology, and the daughters who first preserved these stories faded from history altogether. Their silence echoes through the centuries, inviting us to imagine what they knew, what they saw, and what they feared. Among these forgotten women, some may have taken paths far different from the one chosen by Cain's wife. Not every daughter remained near the early family settlements. Some may have sought independence, forming new communities separated from the influence of Cain, Seth, or their parents. These women, whose names we will never know, may have become the matriarchs of tribes that later emerged as mysterious peoples in biblical history, groups whose origins remain obscure because their genealogies were never recorded. Their absence warns us that Scripture shows only one branch of a much larger human story. Meanwhile, within Cain's lineage, the contrast between creativity and corruption grew sharper with each passing generation. His descendants built instruments that filled the early world with music, tools that shaped the earth, and structures that altered the landscape. But they also inherited their ancestors' spiritual restlessness, a disconnection that seemed to deepen over time. This tension between innovation and moral decline became a defining rhythm of humanity before the flood. Cain's wife, though unnamed, was the starting point of that rhythm, the quiet origin of a complex and conflicted lineage. Her legacy reaches even further than Cain's story, for through her, humanity learned that even those burdened with exile could still build, create, and multiply. Her faithfulness to a difficult path produced generations whose impact reached across centuries. Without her, the story of early civilization loses its coherence. She became the vessel through which Cain's line continued, a line that would ultimately stand as both a testament to human potential and a warning about human drift away from divine guidance. But as we trace the influence of these forgotten daughters, another question emerges. What if the early world was far more populated than we imagine? What if the children of Adam and Eve, especially the daughters, multiplied quickly and spread across vast distances? The idea that humanity began with only a handful of people standing alone in a barren world becomes far less plausible. Instead, we see a world teeming with growing clans, budding cultures, and the early signs of civilization, an energetic, unfolding humanity shaped largely by people whose names were never written down. This perspective changes everything. It reframes Genesis not as a minimalistic narrative of a few individuals, but as the visible tip of a much deeper and broader human story. A story filled with lives, relationships, migrations, and discoveries, all carried forward by the daughters of Adam, the silent mothers whose influence filled the ancient world long before their sons ever built monuments or wielded tools. As the ancient world grew and humanity expanded, the early stories that shaped our existence faded into a tapestry of memory, silence, and interpretation. The names of men were etched into records, genealogies, and traditions, but the women, the daughters who carried life forward, who preserved memory, who shaped communities, remained unwritten. Their silence became a hidden chapter of Genesis, one that the text never explicitly describes yet depends on entirely. Without them, the human story collapses. With them, the origins of civilization begin to make sense. This paradox reveals something profound about the way sacred history was preserved and the mysteries it still guards. Cain's wife, standing at the threshold between exile and creation, symbolizes this hidden truth. She left behind everything she knew, her family, her familiar lands, the comforting stories of her mother Eve, and walked into the unknown beside a man marked by judgment. She built a life with him, not in the shadow of Eden, but in a world scarred by human failure. Through her resilience, patience, and unrecorded strength, she became the mother of a line that would influence music, craftsmanship, industry, and culture before the flood. Her silence in Scripture is not a dismissal. It is an invitation to look deeper into the spaces between the verses, where the real story breathes. And what of the other daughters? The ones who spread outward, forming clans across valleys and plains. Their existence challenges the simplistic picture of early humanity as a tiny, fragile group on the brink of disappearance. Instead, they reveal a world that was growing, multiplying, and evolving rapidly. A world teeming with people whose stories were never written because they were too numerous, too ordinary, or too deeply woven into the fabric of life to be captured on parchment. These daughters shaped humanity's first movements, first societies, and first expressions of culture, even though no scroll recorded their names. The silence of these women also underscores something essential about divine revelation. Scripture often highlights the moments that reveal God's character and humanity's moral choices, but it does not attempt to catalogue every life, every decision, or every child born in the ancient world. The gaps are not mistakes. They are intentional openings, spaces where faith, imagination, and inquiry intersect. In these gaps, we discover the truths that Scripture implies but does not articulate. The world was more populated than we thought, the early families more complex, and the mothers of humanity more influential than their absence suggests. But their silence also carries a warning. When only part of the story is preserved, future generations may mistake the fragment for the whole. Many readers assume that early humanity was small in number, fragile in structure, and isolated in experience because Scripture focuses on key figures. Yet the reality, glimpsed through the life of Cain's wife, and the existence of Adam's lost daughters is far richer. The early world was alive with people, emotions, conflicts, alliances, and choices that shaped the destiny of future generations. The fact that these stories were not recorded does not make them any less real. It simply reminds us that history is bigger than text. Cain's wife, though silent in the scrolls, becomes a voice for all the women whose lives were absorbed into the unfolding tapestry of early civilization. Her legacy is not in her name but in the consequences of her courage. She chose to build a future with a man who carried both guilt and destiny in equal measure. She raised children who would transform humanity. She lived between worlds, between the memory of Eden and the emerging reality of civilization. And through her, the story of early humanity gained shape, direction, and continuity. As we reflect on her life and the lost daughters of Adam, we are reminded that every generation carries both remembered and forgotten voices. The remembered give us the structure of history, the forgotten give us its depth. The men whose names fill the genealogy stand as landmarks, but the women whose lives went unrecorded form the landscape itself, the soil from which every culture, every lineage, and every story eventually grew. This truth reaches into our world today. It reminds us that the silence surrounding the origins of humanity is not emptiness, but mystery. It calls us to look beyond what is written and consider what must have been. It urges us to imagine the mothers, the daughters, the unnamed figures whose sacrifices, wisdom, and presence made humanity possible. Their stories may be hidden, but their impact is eternal. And perhaps this is the deepest message hidden in the early chapters of Genesis, that the things left unsaid are often the ones that matter the most. The Bible gives us the outline of creation, but the full painting stretches far beyond the frame. Cain's wife and Adam's lost daughters stand just outside the edges of the written text, their shadows touching every word, reminding us that even in silence, their legacy speaks.